Hello, and welcome to Coyoteonomics, another episode in which Tyson and I discuss the world and things that interest us. And this video is going to be about Bjorn Lomborg's False Alarm, a book that came out earlier this year. It's brand new off the presses, and it's basically a critical look at the climate alarmism that has been gripping the world, especially in the last decade. And and Tyson is going to do an introduction and a primer on the concept of the greenhouse effect.
Okay. So I want to be abundantly clear that there is an important distinction to be made between the greenhouse effect and global warming. The greenhouse effect is the simple statement that like greenhouses work. Like greenhouses function under the greenhouse effect. The basic idea is that most of the sun's light that comes to us comes in the form of ultraviolet light that can pass through our atmosphere. And then it is absorbed by objects and re-emitted as infrared light, which cannot pass through our atmosphere and often can't pass through very many things. So this is, for example, like when you leave your car out on a hot day and it's like 20 degrees warmer inside your car when you open it, that's because of this effect. Ultraviolet light comes in through the windshield, and then the infrared light cannot pass back out, and it just sort of bounces around, and this makes like it warms the inside of your vehicle. And this, in our atmosphere, carbon dioxide is one of the regulators of this effect. So carbon dioxide being the molecule that infrared light won't, or one of the molecules that infrared light won't pass back through on its way out the atmosphere. So the more carbon dioxide you have, in some sense, you have a thicker atmosphere that does a better job of containing those infrared rays and keeping them in the planet. And that is to be differentiated from global warming, which is the statement that due to a variety of factors, we are putting more carbon dioxide into the Earth's atmosphere, and that is causing our globe to warm, which would be like a macroscopic expression of the same concept. So it's important to state that like the idea of the greenhouse effect, you could do an experiment at home with like Coke bottles and prove to yourself that like the greenhouse effect is real. It is not disputed. There's a question of whether it is happening, whether there's enough carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, whether it is producing a warming effect. These are questions of like heuristic science that we have to actually observe on the planet.
Hmm.
If I have one more point.
Yes.
I want to talk about carbon sinks, which are the other important thing here. So a carbon sink is an idea of something that takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and like regulates atmospheric carbon. So this is the fact that these are the mechanisms that counteract our emission of carbon dioxide from industry, from breathing, from whatever. And like the principal carbon sinks on our planet are the ocean, which will just absorb carbon dioxide. Again, similar to like a pop bottle, how like the carbon dioxide in your bottle of Coke is absorbed into the liquid. And biomass. I would generally just say biomass, like living things on Earth contain a lot of carbon. And while they're alive, that carbon is inside them and doesn't go out into the atmosphere. And as soon as it dies, it rots and decomposes, and all of that goes back up into the air. So like you can think of all of the living things on Earth as like holding a certain amount of that carbon as well. And like it's important to note that actually like one of our biggest carbon sinks is fossil fuel. Like fossil fuel is millions of years ago, biomass being locked under the Earth's core so that when those animals decomposed, it didn't go back out into the air. And that was the carbon sink that we are now undoing. Like when we light those fuels on fire, that carbon escapes back into the air. And there's lots of carbon sinks. Like there's lots of minerals like chalk and limestone and things like that have carbon in them. But yeah, that's the general idea, is anything that isn't gaseous carbon, anything that takes carbon out of the atmosphere and keeps it as a solid or a liquid is a carbon sink. And there's questions of like, are our carbon sinks able to contend with our emissions, or are we tilting that scale? So yeah, that's like a very, I like to call it a mid-level. It's not like the super high level that I don't think is very useful, and I'm not going to bog you down in like numbers, but like the basic mid-level understanding of like the kind of chemistry that's going on.
Cool. Well, I'm glad I had you do that introduction because you did a much better job than I would have. And that's all stuff that, yeah, that's all stuff that Bjorn Lomborg would find no issue with. So I guess there's different levels of dispute within this. There's the idea of whether global warming is happening, climate change as a concept, and that's something that very few people dispute. Then there's the concept of whether or not it is driven by human beings, whether or not it is anthropogenic global warming. And then there's the third question of whether or not the anthropogenic global warming is this cataclysmic scenario that we should be preparing for right now, or if it's a more of a long-term thing. And yeah, and I think this is one of the reasons why it's unfortunate that this dispute is always broken down to like believers or deniers, or however you want to frame it, because there's a lot of different perspectives among this.
It is a conversation that benefits from nuance and rarely gets it.
Absolutely. And yeah, it's very surprising how much more nuanced it is than what I first thought. And it was a pleasure reading this book because it did shift my perspective quite a bit in favor of things like carbon taxes, whereas previously I found that most of the people who I encountered who argued in favor of government action, in favor of protecting against climate change, I found they argued it in a very disingenuous way. And so it was very hard for me to be swayed on an emotional level, I suppose. And yeah, I found this book to be a pleasure to read. His take is that he thinks it's a serious issue, but he thinks that it's something that isn't going to affect us drastically in the short term. And he references a bunch of UN studies to this effect. Some work by William Nordhaus, who's a Nobel Prize winning economist and modeling scientist.
Yeah.
And he essentially makes the case that around 200 or 300 years from now, it's going to become more serious. And at that point, yeah, we have to have made serious efforts to address it by then, or it's going to really come up to bite us in the ass. However, the short-term alarmism, for lack of a better word, that is being spread about by people like Greta Thunberg or other activists, arguably shoots us in the foot because it puts us in a worse perspective or a worse position to tackle a lot of the issues that are going to be brought to the head and made much more serious in the future by global warming. And yeah, essentially, a lot of the ways in which we approach the solutions to global warming, they're very political. We promote things that come along with a big ribbon cutting ceremony. We promote things that look good on paper or look good for politicians in their 4-year term, but don't actually address the problem in a meaningful way. And yeah, that's the general thesis, is that we should be looking for more long-term solutions, like investing in R&D technology and allowing our economies to grow, so we're in a better position to adapt and evolve when it gets worse. And yeah, that's the short and long of it. And he supports carbon taxes and yeah, investment in nuclear energy and things like that for a short-term approach.
I want to say from the outset, I am a huge supporter of carbon taxes as well. Like, I think they're an essential part of any solution that we would embark on.
Yeah, and it's funny, he made a lot of interesting comparisons between the carbon tax approach and a lot of the standard promises people tend to give. And I know apparently in the Northeast United States, there's a carbon trading network called the RGGI that stands for something, but I can't remember what. And that's a lot of what he used as a standard kind of metric to determine the cost of a ton of CO2 emissions. And he compared a lot of the things that have been kind of tossed around. For instance, David Attenborough, a famous environmentalist and the narrator for the Planet Earth documentary series, he apparently made the promise that he was asked what he would do to reduce his own impact on the climate or his own carbon emissions. And he said that every time he wasn't using his cell phone charger, he will unplug it. And while things like that are certainly good to do in principle, if you add up all the carbon that you'd save by unplugging your cell phone charger over the course of your lifetime, it would add up to about 2 cents on the RGGI. That is to say that if you spent 2 cents on the carbon trading network in the United States, you would make the same promise. And so it kind of puts into perspective what people can actually accomplish on their own a lot of the time, and just the breadth of this problem. And yeah, so basically he makes a big case for the idea that there's not a lot you can do as an individual. So ultimately, don't be too concerned about that, but things like carbon taxes are very effective. And ultimately, the problem is so vast that even if we make massive carbon taxes today and increase carbon taxes incrementally towards the future, it's going to make a very small dent in what we're trying to do. So ultimately, the only way out of this is going to be to find some new emergent technology or some form of carbon capture, and we'll get more into that, or something like that. And so, he mentions a lot about the Paris Accord. I'm just going to kind of keep rambling. If there's anything that you want to challenge me on or jump into, feel free to
I'll just let you dig your own grave.
Cool, perfect, excellent. So the climate.
What about this?
No! Well, honestly, one of the big reasons why I'm very happy to present Bjorn Lomborg's book and not necessarily my own thoughts is because a lot of my own thoughts are based on memes that I saw on the internet. I haven't dug into the research and the actual UN science. So I'd much rather present someone's work and be comfortable with the fact that I'm probably wrong on some things because I haven't looked into this very much myself. But I am quite impressed by this book. And there's a dog barking a lot in the background, so hopefully that's not too all-encompassing.
Oh, that's okay.
Okay. So yeah, one of the things he mentions with the Paris Accord is that the Paris Accord are promises that extend to about, 2030. And so if we were to follow through on all the promises involved in the Paris Accord, it would cost it was about $1 trillion a year starting in 2030 onwards. And if those promises were
United States or worldwide cost,
that would be a worldwide cost.
Okay.
And it would be getting larger and larger as the carbon taxes ramped up, which is the optimal solution. Or no, sorry, that's not the carbon taxes. That's the Paris Accord, which has nothing to do with carbon taxes. It's just promises made by government. But if those promises amped up in proportion to what they would be made now, then it would cost more and more in the future. And that's actually apparently, when governments reference the Paris Accord, they're oftentimes referencing what would happen if those same promises carried on into the future up until the year 2100. And so there's a bit of a confusing disconnect between what was promised by scientists in terms of leading up to 2030 and what's being promised by politicians who are assuming those promises will be made again and kind of doubled down upon.
Oh, absolutely.
And so Bjorn Lomborg, with some calculation, with the help of UN data and William Nordhaus, he discovers that if these promises were made into the future, right up till 2100, and these are the much larger promises than have ever been made in the past, then we would take about 0.5 degrees Fahrenheit off the temperature. And we're expected to raise the temperature by about 7.5 degrees up until 2100. And it would take about 5 degrees off, or 0.5 degrees off of that. So it's not a huge shift. Arguably it's good, but when it costs trillions upon trillions of dollars and would especially harm smaller economies, it's arguably not a good return on investment. And so, yeah, he just tries to make the case that a much better solution would be to invest in education and invest in things that are going to allow us to better deal with these problems as they come up, and realize that 0.5 degrees isn't gonna, that amount of carbon isn't gonna change anything or solve the problem. All it's going to do is delay the impacts of what we're going to have coming by some small degree, by some months or years, not months, some years. But yeah, so ultimately he tries to make the case, and I think he does it quite well, that the problem is so vast at this point, and a lot of the effects that we're going to see, even if we shut down all the power plants today and we stop producing any carbon, a lot of these changes are going to compound into the future as these effects come to fruition. The process doesn't stop today, even if we stop burning fossil fuels. And so these problems are going to compound, and we need to be in a position to solve them. And so the idea of just ending production or is not really a viable solution. We need to. He's saying we need to like basically really double down and invest in new technology and find some sort of solution. Even if we just invested in new forms of nuclear power plants, which have generally decreasing cost over the decades, other than the last few decades, but generally they've been decreasing in cost. And apparently, according to some 2017 studies, if we hadn't been subjected to so much government regulation that caused the types of plans for the nuclear power plants we ended up producing many different forms of nuclear power plants, in part due to imposed government regulation. And according to 2017 studies, the cost of nuclear power could be below that of coal at this point, if it weren't for those particular interventions. And so even if we invested more into the R&D of nuclear tech, then we could be in a much better position to solve these things. But yeah, essentially he's saying that we really need something new. We need something coming in over the horizon to even have a chance of solving this. And things like solar and wind just ain't gonna cut it.
So I'd like to start with that point, because
Cool.
as like longtime fans of the podcast will know, I'm like a big science guy, but I'm not sure that we should be like, to me, the argument that he's making there is that we should gamble on science, that it's like, it's the cryogenics argument. It's like sometime in the future, we'll have all the solutions and they can worry about it then. Like, and I'm not sure that that's really, if it is not combined with like efforts to like curtail the problem, I'm not sure that's really like a safe bet. Like, it's one thing if we say we're going to slow it down as much as we can now, and like in the future, maybe they'll have like the magic bullet. But like, it does seem like a bit of a gamble to me to just be like, oh, like there will be, of course, in the future, there will be better technologies that are cheaper and easier and safer than coal and oil and gas. But like, I don't see any promise of that. And in certain places, like home heating, for example, like natural gas here in Alberta, where we have natural gas, not everyone has like natural gas coming out of the ground, but like here, it is so cheap for us to heat our homes with like natural gas that like to have a competing technology of like electric heating or something like that, it would need to be like astronomically better than what we have now in terms of like alternatives. And certainly I think that will happen eventually, probably. I'm not sure I would gamble that it's going to happen in like 200 years and that we should just hope that it does, I guess. Like, and like every year that you don't like curtail everything, it gets worse, right? Like 10 years from now, it'll be more, how much we could debate, but everyone agrees like 10 years from now, we'll be emitting more, the world will be warmer, it'll have like more momentum, it'll be harder to stop. We'll be more cemented in like 21st century modern lifestyles that are very energy intensive. Like, yeah, so that's kind of my first thing.
Yeah, that's very, very valid. I think what he would say is that that's why we need to have a incrementally increased carbon tax that starts off very small and tries to incorporate the negative externalities of anything that involves carbon production in its production. Would you say that in some part addresses what your concerns are there, or do you think that that's kind of just a?
Are you familiar with the idea of like Pascal's wager? Have you heard of that before?
Absolutely, and I've often thought that global warming argumentation follows a secular form of Pascal's wager.
Yeah, like so essentially the claim of like Pascal's wager is like, if like the risk of not believing in God is like an infinitely bad punishment, then no matter how hard it is to like be a righteous person, like if you do the math, it's always worth it to buy that lottery ticket rather than like be guaranteed damnation. And I would kind of make the same argument here, that like saying that like we have to be careful of the economy and stuff like that. Like the risk is so severe that I think we have to like do what we have to. We need a plan. I think we need a model like what I would argue for is that we need a model with existing technology that will work. And then if the new technologies come, that becomes easier, would be like the approach that I would advocate for, which is different than what he's advocating for, which is that like we do the incremental steps now and maybe we have to ramp it up in the future if like the technologies don't come. I would take the opposite approach, that we should go hard now and have a plan to deliver. Like, and I like the Paris Accord is complete bullshit because it wouldn't, like you said, it wouldn't work. Like, we need a real plan that's like, this will stop the globe from warming. And if we tomorrow invent like cold fusion and like that plan gets a whole lot easier, then that's great for all of us. But we might not. It might be 201 years before we invent cold fusion, and that's like too late then, right? Like,
Yeah, for sure. And I think what he would argue is that, unfortunately, I'm not sure if there is a viable solution right now with today's technology that actually addresses the problem in all of its horrifying nature. Because it is quite a quantity of CO2 that we've released. But
yeah,
perhaps with where nuclear technology is now, we are at the stage where we could transition. And I am a firm advocate that we should be
absolutely
transitioning towards hydro and nuclear as much as possible. The book does point out that until storage technology increases, we have a huge problem with wind and solar, because right now, if you add up all of the storage capacity on the planet Earth, we have the ability to store 20 seconds of energy in terms of our global energy use, and that's just not a lot. And so it puts into perspective how far we are away from solving the problem with intermittent energy supplies like wind and solar.
absolutely.
And so it's definitely going to be something more along the lines of nuclear, or something that's much more perhaps intimidating to certain people, because it's not seen as a green technology, even though it certainly is a green technology. And even apparently coal releases more radiation than nuclear power plants when working properly. Absolutely. I didn't realize that. That's something that I just learned about while re-listening to the book today.
I don't want to like get into a whole thing on nuclear, but the number one thing you hear with nuclear energy is like, what are we going to do with the waste? You create barrels of nuclear waste. Like, what are we doing with the waste now? We're fucking burning it and putting it up into the atmosphere, and nobody's worried about it. Like, if you had to contain all of the waste of like coal energy, it wouldn't be a viable energy source.
That's a really good point.
It's totally cheap because you can freely emit it into the atmosphere. And under like a truly fair carbon tax that captures that cost in a real way, coal, oil, and maybe even natural gas would be like totally non-viable. And I also want to point out, nobody ever talks about what you're going to do with the wind turbines and the solar panels either. Like, a solar panel only has a 30-year lifespan, and then like it's not recyclable. Like, it's full of rare earth metals that are difficult to break down, like, and toxic chemicals. Like, there's no plan. The plan is to dump them in a landfill somewhere. Like,
yeah, absolutely. It seems to be something that's very often overlooked, is how non-environmentally friendly wind and solar are in certain respects. But yeah, oh man, I lost my train of thought. Where were we going with that?
I'm a big believer in defense, after I just shit all over them, in defense of wind and solar. I think wind and solar can be a very viable solution for individual energy needs. If you pitch it to individual people that you're going to cut the wires, and they'll get the energy they can get from solar panels on their roof, and they'll have to cut their consumption to like meet that level of production. I think that's a very realistic solution for a lot of contexts. So like maybe you can't have all the lights on in your house 24 hours a day, things like that. But like the actual energy you need to use like isn't a lot if you did a modest amount of cutbacks, and like solar as like a distributed solution can be highly affected. As like a concentrated like power plant solution is currently unviable, but like lots of experiments in like green homes and smart homes and things like that show that like you can very easily meet your own personal energy needs with wind and solar.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I definitely think it could be a very useful technology in a lot of different contexts. just not necessarily in.
No, it's not a replacement for it. Like, I think it can be useful in these discussions to separate like our personal, like we might call like lifestyle energy consumption versus like industrial energy consumption. And those need like different, all throughout history, they've needed different solutions. Like, you know, the brick making factory in ancient Rome didn't run on the same technology that like people's homes did. And like that's carried through all the way through. So like, yeah, you're not going to have a nuclear power plant in your backyard the same way that like a factory isn't going to put solar panels on the roof and meet its energy needs. Like we need different solutions in different places.
Yep. And another kind of related interesting point that he talks about is that oftentimes green companies are trying to sell wind and or specifically solar power plants or solar technology to kind of small villages in India and Africa. And oftentimes these are rejected because the villagers find that they're not really able to do a whole lot with these technologies. Like they find that it's able to run a lamp in the morning, but it's not really able to run a refrigerator or a stove or much else of what they actually want to use it for. And they often complain that they want real energy and instead of what they're talking about. And it's very interesting that people in the West and in these developed countries are very excited about introducing these technologies to third world developing countries and saying, oh, but yeah, this is all you need. But we're very uncomfortable with them going through their own industrial revolution and getting to the same point that we are.
I really think like it is a very negative representation of the old like noble savage thing. Like I think there are a lot of white people that they think it's sad when like a small village in Africa like gets a power plant because like they like this idea of like people living like in line with nature or some bullshit when like people there want the same lifestyle you want, which is that like, you know, unless you're like giving up your car and your electric lights and your computer to live in a treehouse, like you shouldn't be expecting that other people are doing that either, right? Like
exactly, yeah. Yeah, and we so often, you know, value nature in the West. We enjoy going to the mountains and going to the woods, but then we still want a cell phone, we still want a car, we still want all these amenities. And we look disdainfully at other people who want to develop at the same level.
There's like, it's insidious. Like I think about India all the time. Like the way India is viewed in like American white society is like so like racist, and people are so disappointed, and they're like, they have roads and cars there. Like what's that? I thought it was all monks in the mountains. And you're like, no, like they're a real country. They're real people living real lives. Like,
yeah. And there's also, I think, a point to be made that there's a certain level of wealth wherein you produce a lot more pollution. And if you do go through an industrial revolution that creates much more wealth, you actually tend to see much more pollution being produced by wealthy societies. And so, whereas in very poor societies, they will burn wood and other biomass for fuel and energy, that's way more environmentally taxing than developing to the point like where we are, where obviously we use much more and we consume much more. And so for that reason, we are much more wasteful. But if we did live as they did with our technology, and then we would be, So there's often a fear of industrial revolution in other countries that I think is unwarranted from an environmental perspective.
And I want to like tap into something here that's another like really racist colonial thing that I think happens here, which is that like in Canada, we are particularly bad for this, although Australia and the United States are also bad for this, is that we look at the world and we say, wow, like China is doing all of these emissions and India is doing all these emissions. And look at little old us. We're only like 2% of the world's emissions. Like, why do we need to do anything? How are we going to solve anything? But when you actually do the math, the top 3 emitters per person are Canada, Australia, and the United States. Number 4 is the United Kingdom. Like our personal, like, and a lot of that is like lifestyle, leisure energy that we really don't need to consume. It is not energy that's being spent like harvesting food or like making clothes for our population. It's energy that's being spent like on stupid bullshit, like flying a drone around your yard and stuff like that. And like driving, we do so much driving in our society. It is insane. And like for us to then look and be like, wow, why should China have jobs? Like, it's just, ludicrous. Why should they have electricity in all these Chinese villages? Like, look at all these emissions. And you're like, no, like that is the good energy use. We want industrialization. We want factories and computers and robots. I would question whether we need like the lifestyle stuff, the fun energy use that is not really like keeping us alive and like causing us to thrive. That should be where we're making the cuts, in my opinion. And that's where first world countries can really make a difference, and they don't. And we should also be leading by example, and we don't. Yeah, anyway,
Yeah.
My rant is over, but
Good rant. Yeah, that leads into something I was thinking about as well, is that by the nature of our situation, like we're approaching this problem from the perspective of many different national organizations. We're not one world organization. And so
yeah.
the difficulty of this problem is increased because we're not really going to have a global carbon tax. I mean, it could happen, but chances are that's not going to happen. We're probably going to have different levels of carbon taxes being enforced by different countries to varying levels, depending on how politically advantageous it is to present that as a solution to the problem, depending on the community and the culture there. So it's going to be, it's made much more difficult for that fact. And I think whenever we talk about a particular solution, it's good to keep that in mind, that like we could just stop all CO2 production, but when we say we could do that, realistically, we're probably just talking about Canada, or even just, so like, we're not going to convince China or America necessarily to do the same thing. And it gets really complicated and sticky. Maybe we could if we, are argue adamantly enough, and that's the whole point of arguing adamantly enough. But it seems to me that it makes it much more tricky to approach as well for that reason. The fact that we're all going to be national entities.
I agree. I think America, like, I'll be honest, I don't think Canada can really, we can certainly lead by example. And I think that it's important that we do. Like, I'm really critical of defeatist, like, oh, we might as well just keep polluting attitudes, because like, I'm a firm believer in like, if everyone's jumping off a bridge, why wouldn't you kind of crap? Like,
yeah,
you need to do the right thing, even if it's not going to help. And but America, I really think a lot of countries in the world look to America as like the shining beacon of what first world society looks like. And I really think if there was big buy-in to like, we're going to stop driving, we're going to build bullet trains all over the United States, like every other first world country is doing. We're going to build like cleaner infrastructure. We're going to build solar farms. Like, other nations will want to do that because they will want to be more like the United States. Like, and if like we make it a world where it really is the third world backwaters that are burning coal, you won't want to be the third world backwater that's burning coal. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, totally.
Yeah. The same way, like, you look at small countries like Finland and Denmark and stuff like that, and countries all over the world are looking at them now and being like, these guys are doing things right. And these crappy little countries of like 25 million people, like, everyone wants to be them now. And like, they really did it just by like doing better things and leading by example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of, as I was saying that, I almost kind of choked on my defeatist words, because you're right, that is a very defeatist attitude. And we should just essentially try to do what would work if everyone did it, even if not everyone is doing it, because that ultimately often is the only thing you can do and the only first step in a solution. But yeah, it is tricky.
To like paraphrase John F. Kennedy, like, don't ask what the world can do for you, ask what you can do for the world. Like, if everyone just tried to make a difference, like you talk about like the charger thing, and you're right, like unplugging your charger is not going to save the fucking world. But like, if everybody does the small things and like we start to shift the way we think about it, it really will. In my opinion, that's the only way to solve the problem.
Yeah. And I think the Bjorn Lomborgs of the world would probably agree. I think what he would say is that it's just necessary to understand which of these actions is actually going to do something. Absolutely. And not waste all of our time and our energy and our goodwill on meaningless gestures rather than.
And not pat ourselves on the back for doing something that doesn't make a difference. Like,
yeah, Because oftentimes there's a funny psychological effect where we give ourselves license to pollute more or be a worse person if we feel we've done something good. And if we feel we've done something good because we unplugged our cell phone charger and then we in turn take a
Yeah.
trip to Bali.
Like I easily bought myself a sea turtle by
Yeah.
phone charging. Like
Yeah.
yeah, no, I agree. I'm just sometimes he treads into the territory of like we have to wait for the government to do something because people aren't going to be able to fix it. And I just like fundamentally disagree with that take. I'm not trying to like put those words in his mouth, but he certainly treads that line in place.
Well, he literally has a chapter entitled, I believe it is, "You Can't Solve Climate Change."
Yeah.
And he makes the case that like all these little actions you're doing do nothing relative. Like if you just bought like put $10 into the carbon trading network every year, that would do something. But so in a sense he's saying you can do something, but only when pursuing certain avenues of I guess economic interaction. But
I think like certain individual choices, like electric cars, for example, like one of the big things that's happened now that is going to change our society is that Elon Musk has spent a lot of time and effort giving Teslas to popular famous people, right? Mm-hmm. And now there's lots of popular famous people talking about their Teslas, and as like it gets cheaper and more affordable, people will be like, I want to be like that guy, I'm gonna get an electric car. It's become a status symbol to have like an electric car, and like things like that, like you really can make a difference just by doing things, right? Like they're not always going to be cheap or easy, but putting solar panels on your roof, like fucking insulating your windows so that you like use less energy in the winter. Like I get that like they don't make a huge difference, but even you're talking about like 2 cents per person, like if everybody in the United States does that, that's $18 million, right? Like
for sure.
Like it's like a lot, right?
It definitely still adds up. It's just a question of whether or not it would be make more sense for them to worry about their cell phone charger or just pay 2 cents. I know for myself, I would just rather pay 2 cents rather than.
But you're not going to ultimately. Like you're going to do neither of those things is the result, which is like the problem, right? Like if it was actually like, here, I'm going to put $5 in the collection pot and then I'm good, like that would be great. But there is no part of the problem, I think, is there is no collection pot. Like there's no way to really contribute to that, right?
Yeah, I'd say, and I guess we were on a thread where I think you were making the argument that we need to make a solution talking about the current technologies we have today.
Yes.
And I think the argument that would be made by Bjorn Lomborg is that we don't have the capacity to do that right now. And that's why he's adamant that we need to look to the future for things like carbon capture and emergent green tech.
I'm skeptical of that only because 100 years ago, we didn't have electricity. Like it's such a these massive energy sinks are such a new phenomenon that like, I really don't think, certainly we've had like widespread population growth that is perhaps more difficult to sustain, but I don't think it's impossible. Like, I'm not saying I'm advocating for this, but in the extreme case where you just say like, we're turning off the power plants tomorrow and people got to make do, like you could do that and that would work, right? Like, and I think somewhere between that and doing nothing, there's something we could do that would make enough of a difference without like necessarily, but like, I really believe that even if it is like, honestly, even if it is like 100 million people are gonna starve to death or whatever, like if it's that or like all of us die, like at some point you have to make that difficult decision, like even if there is like starvation and lack of access to water or whatever on the table, like at some point that may be a decision we have to make as a species if we want to survive.
Yeah, and I think what he argues as well is that even if you take the worst case scenario and you go by the UN data, there's no scenario that leads to the end of the human race. And like at least, according to what he's saying and the data presented in the book, we often talk about these issues as if humans are going to die off in 50 years. And apparently there's no scenario, unless ocean acidification happens and a keystone species gets wiped out and something happens that we don't foresee that's just an annihilating event.
Yeah.
Essentially, I forget what the exact numbers were, but 100 years from now, the effects of global warming would essentially amount to a small percentage, like a one-digit percentage point of the total GDP of the planet. So it would be like a small cost relative to all the things we're spending our money on. And if we don't deal with it, properly, then the cost will get bigger and it will become worse over time. But still, it's just going to be something that's expensive. It's not going to be a world-ending event. And right now, we're talking about these extreme weather events as if they're getting much more frequent and violent across the planet. And he presents a bunch of UN evidence that essentially states that in almost all cases, when you look at wildfires, flooding, hurricanes, and drought, there's not really any good data to suggest that on a global scale these things are increasing, and we have this perception that they're just kind of on this runaway path to the destruction of all human beings. And he presents a lot of information that I think gives good reason to doubt that.
Yeah, I mean, we could get into the weather stuff, but generally I'm of the same perspective that for some reason we've become highly focused on weather events. And I think it's because they're extremely financially destructive and they make it personal for a large number of people. Like when you have a hurricane that hits New Orleans and you get to mobilize 10 million people against something to blame for it, that becomes a very powerful force that you can leverage against something. But generally, to your point, I do think that we are losing the rainforest. For sure is disappearing, which is the world's largest active carbon sink, the largest concentration of biomass on our planet. We are seeing the growth of the desert in Africa in particular. The growth of the desert is so pronounced that it is visible from year to year. There are tribes that relocate every year because the ground is no longer viable for them to live on and things like that. We really are seeing some of these things. I don't think hurricanes are really certainly you get more rainfall in general. Actually, I'll talk about another science thing. I'm going to go into a science lecture.
Go for it.
So why is it that we create why is it that we have the growth of deserts around the equator is a question you might ask. Because if it's getting warmer, we should be evaporating more, right? Would be the theory.
Mm-hmm.
But what tends to happen on our planet because of the way it's striated is that most of the evaporation happens at the equator because that's where it's warmest. And so it can absorb, dissolve the most water in the air, if you will. And then those currents move towards the poles. And as it gets colder there are rainfalls along the way. And every time it rains, less of it gets sucked back up into the atmosphere, if you will. And more of it is distributed in groundwater or rivers or what have you, many of which lead back towards the equator. But as you heat up and you accelerate that cycle, you're relocating more and more of the world's moisture, I guess, for lack of a better term, towards the poles. And the extreme case of that is the polar ice caps, which are frozen and never evaporate. So you're naturally going to see, it's an expected phenomenon. It would be a strange result if we were not seeing deserts grow and a loss of biodiversity around the equator. And we are absolutely seeing that. I would say that the growth of other forests closer to the pole are less, they don't make up for what you're losing.
That's right, absolutely. And that's something that he mentions in the book, that we have had a growth in forests equal to Australia times 2. If the continent of Australia were completely covered in trees, we've had that amount 2 times over up here in the last 35 years. But much of it has been in the northern areas, and they function much less as a carbon sink.
And you can think just think as you hunt, you've gone out to the woods and maybe once in your life, like you've been on a trip to like Costa Rica or something and seen like a rainforest, but like our forests don't really hold a lot of like life in them. Like the boreal forest is mostly like coniferous trees with maybe a small bed of like lichen or moss underneath it and like scattered animals. It's not like a rainforest where it's like gazillions of animals and like 17 layers of vegetation and all of that. Like you can really plainly see if you visited both that like one of them has a lot more life in it than the other.
Absolutely. And I know I referenced this fact earlier in the podcast episode, but yeah, in the Amazon rainforest, if you look at one pond the size of half a tennis court, that has more biodiversity than all the rivers and streams of Europe in terms of number of fish. So the Amazon is like, yeah, they're insane for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I do kind of want to just like list off a few of the surprising facts about these weather events, just for the sake of, I thought these were very surprising. And I'm trying to find ways in which he might be being misleading with this information because it sounds very surprising, but I'm open to that and have yet to find a convincing argument. So when it comes to droughts, UN scientists in their last major global level report, they said there's low confidence in global scale observed trend of drought. And since 1950, drought has likely increased in West Africa and the Mediterranean, but it has decreased in Central North America and Northwest Australia. And the United States' most recent National Climate Assessment, or the NCA, confirms that droughts are declining in the United States. And they also say that the link between man-made climate change and drought is weak. That's the UN scientists.
Yeah.
And
one caveat I would give to that is that like the man-made climate change of like destroying the rainforest is absolutely contributing to drought, but carbon emissions likely are not. Like, yes. I take issue with the use of man-made climate change there because there's more than just global emissions that we're like changing the climate.
Absolutely. And deforestation for the purposes of farming, which is, I think, what you're referring to mainly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just like slash and burn agriculture around the equator.
Yeah, that's awful. And to be clear, I think lots of pollution and destruction of the environment should absolutely be addressed. And then the book makes lots of points to, go off on a tangent slightly. Yeah. Like for the polar bears, for instance, the biggest threat to polar bears is hunting. And if we want to protect the polar bears, we should be approaching the solution with that in mind, rather than, it seems we have a great tendency to blame everything on global warming these days, and it almost takes us away from the appropriate solution. In the case of polar bears, talking about the number of hunting that takes place in Alaska or Northwest Territories. But
I actually I agree with you 100%. And I think it's like telling with a lot of things in our society, we tend to latch on to these large intractable problems that are impossible to solve because those are very like easy to leverage for whatever goal. But like if you look at it in terms of like much more like approachable, like the destruction of like coral reefs, for example, like that's like a very small, contained, easy to address climate change problem that is like causing all sorts of other issues, and we just don't like or like the destruction of the rainforest. Like we could just say we're not going to import food from Uruguay anymore until they stop doing it. But we don't. Like, we just let them keep doing whatever.
I'm curious what you mean by that. You're saying the problem of the destruction of coral reefs is very solvable and contained? I thought it...
All we would have to do is ban certain shipping routes. Like, most of the damage done to coral reefs is by boats, just, like, plowing through them, essentially. There are deeper systemic issues with, like, ocean acidification and stuff like that are harder to tackle with. But like the physical, like we're just plowing through this coral reef to make a housing development or whatever, like that's still happening everywhere in the world, and it's very solvable.
Yeah,
like by international. And there is like CFCs are like the great success story of this. So like CFCs or like chlorofluorocarbons, which were what they used to use to power aerosol cans, and that's what caused the hole in the ozone layer. And like we did mobilize and we banned them, and now it's all nitrous oxide, and like it worked, and the whole ozone layer is like closing because like we all just agreed we're going to not do this, and we solved it and dealt with it, and it's done.
Yeah, we properly diagnosed the problem.
Really like tear off a bite-sized piece of it and deal with it, over time you eat the whole animal, right? Like,
Yeah.
But instead, like, if you just make it like, oh, like making global warming into a boogeyman just makes it so that it, like, it's a problem that can be exist forever. Like, global warming, even in the future, will never go away. It's always going to be something that has to be like in the back of our minds. Whereas there are things that we'll be able to be like, yeah, like we just don't do this anymore. We don't burn coal anymore. There's no acid rain anymore. Leaded gasoline, another great example of like, we stopped doing that and it stopped being an issue. And,
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, if we looked at things more that way, I think it would be less of a problem.
Yeah, I think there's, it's great to address a solution and actually solve it. It's just really need to make sure we diagnose the problem properly. And I think I think obviously you agree, there's a tendency towards blaming everything on global warming these days.
Well, and like even deeper than that, like blaming it on emissions, because I would say one of the largest drivers of global warming is the destruction of the rainforest, because like that is both through burning it, releasing a massive amount of biomass into the atmosphere, and like you never get that back. Like a farm doesn't absorb an acre of like farmland, especially cattle farmland, which is what a lot of Brazil is doing, and Uruguay. Like, it's nothing close to the carbon sequestration of an acre of rainforest. Like, there's no comparison to be made.
Yeah. Another example they brought up that I thought was quite funny. I'm sure you heard when the Syrian conflict was happening that was blamed on global warming as well. The whole conflict that broke out.
Really?
And apparently there's a lot of research done, and conflict generally happens more often when things are very cold and crops can't grow as well when it's cold. And conflict is more associated with a decrease in temperature, not an increase in temperature. So just the idea of attributing it, number one, the idea of attributing a conflict randomly to climate change is absurd without any actual data, which is what we all did. Well, not we all did, but a lot of people did. And number two, even if we were to do that, it would make much more sense to attribute it if it was a decrease in temperature, which is not what we're seeing. But that's an extremely absurd example that probably not a lot of people took seriously, but enough did that it was something I heard about when it was happening.
I know. Stuff like that is always amazing to me.
Yeah, it kind of blows my mind.
Social sciences, man.
I just want to go on a few more of these random factoids about extreme weather events around the world. So when it comes to flooding, according to the UN scientists, it is unclear if flooding is becoming more or less frequent. Concerning inland flooding, UN scientists say there's a lack of evidence and thus low confidence regarding what the trend is, both in terms of magnitude and frequency of floods on a global scale. And once again, very surprising as someone who hasn't really learned too much about this. I've seen a lot of headlines implying the opposite, but apparently there's just not a lot of good evidence that it's this extreme trend that we're all referencing.
Absolutely. It's important to, and it was kind of my job to do this reading and I didn't do it, but like, it's important to question with these things, like what is the definition of flooding, for example? Like, because I think a lot of these things, like, as you have like desertification is something that is like attestable by like satellite photography and things like that. You're obviously going to have less flooding. That doesn't necessarily mean that like the problem is going away or that it's getting better or that it's not changing. Like if you look at individual places in the world, there are certainly places that are suffering from more flood damage than before. And there are places that are suffering from less. And I think like those geographic shifts can be important to research as opposed to like a global is like climate change causing more flooding in some sense on a global scale is like a complicated question to define.
Mm-hmm. And a big part of flooding that he talks about, and he talks about this with respect to wildfires and droughts as well, but our ability to adapt is huge. And when countries are richer and they can build things like levees and dams and floodplains and even just investing in mangroves. Apparently mangroves is a very efficient way of combating flooding.
Yeah.
Just things like that. The capacity to invest in adaptation and infrastructure that can basically help us deal with these things is huge. And so that's why we see the most flood damage happening in poorer areas of the world. And and it just pointing out just the level of adaptation that has occurred. And that's often not taken into account in lots of studies that predict very much doom and gloom, is that they will predict what will happen in 100 years if all this happens, but humans don't adapt at all. And it's like a very bad report. But obviously that's not very realistic, because human beings constantly adapt with government intervention or not. And so that's something to watch out for, is the assumption that no adaptation will take place in some of these studies.
Oh, absolutely. I think the ultimate solution, if we go down like a road that leads us towards climate change, is that we will leave. We'll go to another planet or whatever. And not all of us, but like enough of us. Like, I think were the economic incentives there, we could do that today. And certainly in 100 years, we could do it much better than we can now, even to a place as close as the moon. Like, it wouldn't take that much to set up like a viable colony on the moon, if there was the incentive to do so, which there isn't. But
yeah, I'm definitely in favor of putting our eggs in multiple baskets, so to speak.
Yeah.
Because, you know, one meteor of big enough size and we're kind of gone. So I think that's wise. Also, another thing that is a consistent theme in a lot of these reports that I think is misleading is that studies will calculate the economic damage that is caused by certain disasters. And they kind of ignore that because human prosperity has increased so much over the last 100, 200 years, the damage that is done is going to be way more. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the actual disasters are getting worse. It just means that the amount of stuff to destroy is more. And if you control for that variable, apparently you get much different results. And that's another thing to look out for, apparently.
I think that a factor there as well is that sort of the widespread adoption of like things like housing insurance and stuff like that have created a perverse incentive. You hear about all the time in like the southeastern United States, like there are people whose houses get like wiped out by flooding or hurricanes or whatever every year, but because they have like this government mandated insurance, they can just rebuild their house every time it happens. Whereas before, people would either build like more robust structures or they would build somewhere else, right?
Yeah. And I know actually John Stossel, who I know you're a recent fan of, mentions interesting stories to this regard of
lived in one.
Yeah.
And he owns one of those houses.
And I guess FEMA functions as an institution that gives out, basically subsidizes this type of insurance. So if you live in one of these places, oftentimes you're given very subsidized insurance that essentially removes any incentive to plan or build responsibly with this in mind. And
it's very much like a Medicaid style program where they mandate that companies have to provide this insurance, because before companies would just say, we're not going to insure that house. And that was seen as the issue. And so it's a combination of a mandate and a subsidy. So they say you have to provide this insurance, but we'll back a lot of the cost and pay some of the premiums and yada, yada, yada. Okay. So of course, like anytime you're in a situation where you're not paying for the consequences of your actions, you're going to have an incentive to be less cautious, which is unfortunate.
Indeed.
But that's mostly a localized phenomenon to like the first world. If you go to like Vietnam or something, that's not happening.
They don't have, It's funny how just irrational we get with spending when we get to a certain level of wealth, but I'm just gonna roll right along. We keep talking, the delay. Okay, the wildfires is an interesting one, because the nature of fire, we used to have a lot more outdoor burning fires and fires within our house, but because of the, I guess, Perrig transition, most combustion takes place in automobiles and factories, and this has caused a lot of, and also due to forest management, this has caused a lot of the forest fires to be much less damaging, especially in first world countries. And so we've had a very large decline in forest fires. But yeah, this is hard to measure because so much of it is due to shifting technologies and how we're just a lot more safer. We do controlled burnings. We divide forestry areas. We are just a lot more intelligent when it comes to fire. So it's hard to measure exactly how much more dangerous fires are becoming due to climate change. But yeah, apparently 70 years ago, we had a very high point in wildfires. And while we've had a slight uptick recently, it's still very mild relative to the highs of 70 years ago. And then hurricanes. UN scientists have found that globally, hurricanes are not getting more frequent. They find no significant observed trends in global tropical cyclone frequency. They do find an increase of storms in the North Atlantic, but link this to air pollution. They specifically say there is low confidence in attributing changes in hurricane activity to human influence. The US National Climate Assessment, the UNA, it agrees with this conclusion. And NASA also confirms that this is the case, adding that it will not be possible to even calculate the impact of climate change on hurricanes for at least a couple of decades. And a 2018 study shows that continental land-falling hurricanes show no trend in frequency or intensity. And there's actually a slight downward trend, but one that is statistically insignificant. And yeah, and once again, Bjorn Lomborg does say that the science indicates that these things are going to be getting worse in the future. We don't know that for sure, but especially things like hurricanes and droughts, it implies that they will be getting much worse in the future. Even like hurricanes, they might not increase in frequency, but they'll increase in intensity. And there's still something to worry about, but we're not really in this doomsday scenario. We're not in the midst of it, as some might imply. At least there's no evidence when it comes to the extreme weather events.
So that actually leads me into a point that I wanted to make. So I wanted to talk about like the ice caps and like the function that they play as like a temperature regulator. So like as long as if you think of like a glass of water with ice cubes in it, right? Like it will stay very cold, like close to zero for as long as there's ice in it. And then as soon as the ice is gone, it will rapidly warm up. And this is because like water in particular, but any material, as it undergoes a state change, it will absorb a huge amount of energy. So like when ice melts, it's kind of weird to think about, but like when ice melts, it sucks up a lot of heat to like undergo that state change. And it's not really like a linear transition. And so as long as the ice caps are there and melting, they're mitigating a lot of like the warming effects, which is why we don't see like rapid warming, even though we've had like rapid emission of CO2, because we sort of get this buffer. But eventually that will run out, and then it will start to warm like much, much faster, like perhaps an order of magnitude. And that's like something to keep in mind. So like people will say like, oh, like it's only, you often hear things quoted like it's only been half a degree or whatever, but like we are seeing like a dramatic loss of polar ice that I don't think anybody would deny. And like once that is gone, it will like amp everything up a lot. And so that's like an effect we should be aware of, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, there's definitely lots of things that we should be concerned about in all of this. Personally, I think the subject that concerns me the most is ocean acidification.
Yes.
Partially because I don't know too much about it. I know that the process prevents the formation of calcium-based shells by mollusks and other shellfish and corals. And so that's a lot of creatures, and the danger of it taking out a keystone species, like a species at the center of an ecosystem that a large amount of biodiversity relies on, is a huge, scary thing. And that is terrifying. And so I don't think anyone can reasonably argue that we shouldn't be pursuing solutions. I think the only arguments that can be made are, what are the most rational solutions? Are the rational solutions to try to, like what degree of effort should we put into it right now? Should we put like a very high carbon tax so that we prevent more economic growth in the future, but tackle this more head on today? Or should we allow more economic growth and a lower carbon tax so that we allow more economic growth in the future and are perhaps in a better position to tackle it through adaptation and technology decades from now? And yeah, to me, that seems to be the
thoughts out there that I think you're on the right track with ocean acidification, but I would go even a step further and just say like the general degradation of our ocean as a carbon sink. And like, there's a whole bunch of separate related processes, a lot of which we talked about. Like you're talking about like killing shellfish, which will obviously, again, like carbon sinking is about biomass. So anytime you're killing off a large mass of animals, you're going to lose that ability to hold carbon. Where overfishing, propagation of plastic in the ocean water prevents sunlight from traveling through, which reduces like the amount of biodiversity of like plankton and photosynthesizing organisms. Like whales are dying. Like we have a whole bunch of related processes that are generally making the ocean less efficient as our primary carbon sink.
Yeah,
Coral
totally.
we talked about that too, like which again is related to ocean acidification and the loss of like these crustaceans and everything.
Which I suppose speaks to the idea that we should really be broadening the conversation to issues beyond CO2, because these are very serious issues, but they're not just about CO2.
Yeah.
And I also wanted to just mention, and I don't know much about this, and apparently no one does, but Antarctic is also growing in terms of ice mass, and we don't quite know why, but that's just something interesting that I have been hearing about as well, that while the Arctic is melting at a very quick rate, the Antarctic is growing. And well, I'm not trying to diminish the seriousness of the problem. It speaks to the mystery that is this world. We don't even know why that's happening. That blows my mind. But
yes, I guess like generally something I wanted to bring up that I'll just bring up now is that like there's sort of two ways to study global warming, which is like in the lab or like in the the weather observatory. And like in the lab, like the theoretical models are all in agreement that like we're going in a bad direction. But like our world is a very big, complicated, chaotic thing. And the same way, like you don't necessarily in obvious ways see the expression of physics in every cell and function of your body. Like we won't see the expression of these things on the planet, but that doesn't mean that like the larger trend isn't there. Like everyone agrees, more carbon is going to warm the world. There's discussions about what the graph will look like, but everyone's on the same page that 200 years from now it's going to be in a very bad place.
Absolutely, yeah. And but maybe this is a good time to bring up maybe more optimistic elements of the discussion.
Sure.
Apparently, Richard Branson and Al Gore have put forward a $25 million prize to the first company or agency or group of people who can develop a form of carbon capture that meets certain specifications to the point where it's actually financially viable in certain economies at least, which I think is very interesting. And we actually haven't even talked about carbon capture as a concept that much. You did in a little bit with the carbon sinks, but there are, I guess, a few different approaches to that, which are very
deep ocean iron fertilization.
Hey, maybe you want to talk about that a bit.
Okay, this is one of my like pet things because nobody has heard of this, and it's like a tested, established, scientifically proven technology. So essentially, the idea is that in the ocean you have like plankton that are like photosynthesizing organisms that like absorb carbon, and that's one of the primary ways that our ocean functions as a carbon sink, is by these like plants, essentially single-celled plant organisms that live in the water. And the limiting factor of their growth in most places of the deep ocean is iron, which is only absorbed in the ocean through like sands blowing in from the continent and like sometimes deep ocean vents of like magma. So there's not a lot of iron readily available in the ocean. So there's been a lot of experiments done where you just drive a boat out to the middle of the ocean and dump like literally tons of like filed down iron into the water, and you create these giant blooms of plankton and algae that will absorb like massive amounts of carbon from the atmosphere, and then they die and more or less filter down to the bottom of the ocean and are gone forever. And it's like I don't know if it's been studied on the Reggie, but it's studied on there's like a similar one they have in like Eastern Europe that Russia kind of runs, where they buy and sell carbon credits. Mm-hmm. And like there, this technology is seen as the most viable way of like earning carbon credits. Like it is cheaper and more efficient than planting forests. It's cheaper and more efficient than like atmosphere scrubbing and things like that. It tends to produce a related effect, which is called cloud brightening, which is when you introduce particulate matter into the sky so we talked about how you have like UV light coming in and infrared light bouncing back. One way to solve that problem is to stop UV light from getting in by like thickening your atmosphere enough that it reduces that. And the evaporation of iron into your clouds is one way of accomplishing that. That is a byproduct of deep ocean iron fertilization. It's just great. And nobody has heard of this. I guarantee you watching at home have never heard of this thing. And you're going to go look it up on Wikipedia and be like, why was I never told that they've done 17 successful experiments with this technology? And like, nobody wants to do it. I'll admit it's a little bit like the Futurama dumping the giant ice cube in the ocean thing, but like it does work. And as a way of like offsetting an essential amount of carbon emission, if you believe that some must happen, it's not a bad fix.
Yeah, and I'm very surprised that Bjorn Lomborg's book didn't mention this, because he does have a whole chapter on geoengineering wherein he talks about other forms of releasing some sort of, I forget what chemical, but some sort of something into the upper atmosphere that would basically just cause the same effect that you're describing.
Cloud brightening.
Cloud brightening. And I'm very surprised that didn't come up, because that sounds
it's secret.
Very interesting. It's a secret technology. Yeah, and I think that the idea of emerging technologies like that I think that's very, very cool. And there's also a guy who's exploring the potential of algae that grows on the surface of the planet that pulls CO2 from the atmosphere as part of its growth and development, and that creates oil. And then the oil is burned and creates more CO2, but because that CO2 is also pulled from the atmosphere in production of the oil, it's more of a carbon neutral process rather than burning oil that was sequestered deep in our Earth core.
That reminds me, I have not checked up on it. I was very closely about 10 years ago following an emerging technology in the United States where they were using like slaughterhouse offal essentially, and like using like a mechanical process, like mimicking like the natural process that creates oil. And so they were taking like turkey guts and turning it into like bitumen that you could then like refine as like oil. Yeah.
Interesting.
So it's like the exact thing that happens like in the Earth's crust, just like it's kind of like making an artificial diamond. It's the same idea that you just like pressurize the shit out of it. And it was like economically viable without subsidy. So like it's not very scalable, but
right. Until we get a whole bunch of hydraulic presses.
Yeah,
that process.
More animals, like that would be the
sure.
Yeah, it's not the greenest technology in the world, but
yeah,
it's not a bad idea. I think if I was to tell my fans at home to like really invest in one thing, creative problem solving, like think of new ideas, try new things. Don't gamble that like your new idea is going to solve all the world's problems. You don't have to worry about it, but like be creative, be willing to accept ideas that seem a little out there, because that's how every problem in history has been solved.
It's true.
200 years ago, capturing lightning from the sky to power a light bulb in your home was science fiction, and now we do it every day. Like we electrocute rocks and teach them how to think. Like you know, we do.
Well, took me a second to realize what you're saying.
Yeah, that's my vision of a computer, a rock.
Yeah.
That's how to think. But like, we really do these things, and there's no reason we couldn't like solve problems by thinking creatively. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that it is important to include things like the carbon tax in our short-term solution.
Yes.
But at the same time, I am really optimistic in the emerging tech that's coming down the pipeline in terms of carbon capture, in terms of new technology, and to geoengineering to some degree. Which, it makes me more nervous, but as well, especially what you're describing sounds less dangerous based on.
Well, I mean, people still think it's probably kind of dangerous, but I mean, whatever. Like, so is like lighting the planet on fire. So you got to do something.
Yeah, and it seems like the kind of thing that maybe could have unforeseen consequences when pursued on a massive scale, but maybe we just try it out on a smaller scale and just continue to experiment with it.
We're trying so hard to keep our ocean pure, and we never dump anything into it. So I mean, like, I understand where people are coming from. Like,
yeah,
I don't know. In a world where like we have a fucking island the size of like Manhattan made of garbage in the middle of the ocean, it amazes me that people are getting upset about like algae, and they're like, what is algae gonna do in the middle of the ocean? I'm like, I don't know, man. What is plastic doing in the middle of the ocean? Like,
yeah, it's
algae
strange.
doesn't seem that dangerous to me.
Yeah, and so just to be clear, when that algae dies, it does fall to the bottom of the ocean and dies down there, and is somehow sequestered and does not release back into
a percentage of it will like almost like disperse into the water, like it'll just dissolve basically on its way down. Like things fall to the bottom of the ocean very slowly because of the way that ocean currents work, and they'll be like eaten by other creatures and stuff like that. So as percentage in the deep ocean, once you fall past the light line, basically, there's no living things. And so anything that falls past that point falls to the bottom of the ocean and stays there until like continental shift raises that, which is like billions of years, right?
Right.
And then a percentage of it will be dissolved into the water, perhaps through the process of like being eaten and pooped out or whatever, and will sort of like disperse into the ocean currents and go away. And a percentage of it will be like accumulated in the food chain and carried off to places where it'll eventually be re-emitted. But even under like, even the bits that like do eventually go back into the atmosphere, it's usually sequestered for over 200 years, which beats like every other viable technology we have. Like a forest, everyone talks about the forest. A tree does not hold carbon for 200 years in most cases.
Yeah.
It gets it for like, especially like, the boreal forest, which is prone to forest fires. Like a tree lives maybe 50, 60, 70 years. A good tree might get 100 and some years. But as soon as that tree dies, it's important for people to realize that it all goes back up into the air.
Mm-hmm.
It's eaten by organisms and exhaled, or it just rots off or whatever. Like trees are not like digging a grave for themselves and burying themselves for hundreds of years after they die. Like they fall on the Earth's surface and re-emit everything.
Yeah, and apparently, obviously, planting trees is a good way of capturing carbon and solving this problem to some degree, but we couldn't plant enough trees over the surface of the Earth to actually make a meaningful dent at the problem. So while it is a good thing to do, it's not gonna, that's just another point that was made in the book.
I would really encourage people to think of biomass as the real carbon sink. Like any living thing, there's no difference in terms of carbon sequestration between me and a tree except like weight. We are roughly the same percentage by weight of carbon, and as long as we are alive, we're hanging on to that carbon. And I encourage people to think about that. So it's not just how many trees, it's like what's growing on the floor underneath them, it's the animals that live in them. And like under that model, we should look at the coniferous boreal forest and realize that it's a horrible carbon sink, because a pine tree's whole mechanism is that it kills off everything else around it and is not a hospitable habitat to any organism. There's some scientists that theorize that like the like falling of needles underneath the pine tree is a mechanism that causes forest fires intentionally, because like pine trees are highly resistant to it relative to other types of trees.
Mm-hmm.
So they like have evolved over time to kill other trees off with fire and then like rise from the ashes. So like which isn't to say, like, I'm not saying at all that like obviously our forest is doing good and it's important, but like this idea that like the Canadian Shield is fucking saving the planet is just not true. It is not a very efficient mechanism of carbon sequestration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm kind of reaching the point where I'm not sure of any additional points that I'd want to make. I feel like I've given a good impression or given a good representation of the book, in the sense that these are the arguments he makes and this is what he believes, and whether or not it's true, there might be flaws and all sorts of issues which I'd love to learn about and talk about in future episodes. But I think I'm at that point. Do you have any additional?
I would ask you, I'm putting you on the spot now.
Okay.
What would be your, as somebody who's sympathetic to his ideas, what would be your sharpest criticism having listened to the book? Like, you've listened to it several times, from my understanding. So
yeah,
like,
three times now.
Are there things that stand out to you that you're like, I don't really think that was a good argument, or I think he was reaching, or something like that?
Man, thank you for reminding me. He is very human focused. He focuses on the impact that climate change will have on human beings and doesn't really focus on plants or animals. Now, granted, this is because he views human beings as being in the position to most solve the problem. And so he's trying to say we need to help humans, make them rich so that they can solve the problem actually effectively when we have the technology and the wealth to do so. But it's very much a human-centric post or book. He talks about all of the effects in terms of GDP, in terms of damage to human societies, in terms of death of human life. He doesn't talk about loss of biodiversity very much. He references it a little bit, but it's pretty much all focused on human impact. And that would be my biggest criticism.
That reminds me of one more point that I was going to bring up, which is that like often these conversations, and you brought it up at the start, so I'm assuming he talks about it, like the conversation gets sidelined by like man-made climate change. And there's like these questions of like, oh, like we aren't doing it. The earth is in a natural cycle and blah, blah, blah. But like, ultimately that doesn't fucking matter. Like if it will kill us, who knows what is causing it? Like if the effect is that the world is warming and it will become inhospitable for human life, and there's something we can do to stop it, who cares what is ultimately causing it? Like, if a gigantic super volcano erupts tomorrow and like emits a gazillion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, it will still be an emergency for us. It won't be like, we'll be like, wow, it's the volcano's job to fix it. Like,
yeah.
Like we need to be ready to solve these problems if you believe they're a problem. And I think there is a debate to be had of like, certainly some of the effects of climate change I think are grossly exaggerated. But if you believe there is climate change, it shouldn't matter to you what is causing it. It should be about what it's going to do and what we can do to stop it.
I think that's a really good point. Yeah, if it's a problem, it doesn't matter how it came about.
And if it's not a problem, then it doesn't matter either, right? Like,
yeah.
If it's not a problem, who cares if we're causing it? If you are one of these people that believes we have a robust planet that will adapt and that nothing bad will happen, then who cares? Again, if it's humans or a volcano, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I'm ready for final thought time. Are you at that point?
Yes.
Okay.
So I think you go first, right?
Because it's my episode, I believe you go first, or I'm presenting. So,
but I'll go. I guess my final thought would be that this is an issue where I deeply encourage people to engage with the actual science. I think it is very easy on either side of this issue to fall into a sort of tribal mindset, or to like not want to think about it because like it seems scary or whatever. And I think a lot of the science is very approachable, and it doesn't take a lot to educate yourself and get a big step up on like what's really going on. And that would be my final thought. Like, go out there, read some studies, maybe do an experiment, like convince yourself of what science you really think is established and what isn't.
Yeah, my final thoughts would be that we need to be comfortable with approaching these conversations with nuance and not fall into the tribalistic mindset of thinking that there's our side and the wrong side, because there's a lot of different middle ground positions. And I found this while talking about this book with several people, is that, like my dad, for instance, thinks that Bjorn Lomborg takes global warming too seriously. And he thought he was just like, yeah. So he put him off in this side over here as being wrong. And other people put him in the camp of denier. Someone said that he was a global warming denier. And I thought that was very interesting because he very clearly says it's something serious, but because his narrative was something that they disagreed with, he was a denier. And we need much more, we need a lot more categories than just denier and acceptor or whatever we have to be saying. And be comfortable with the fact that there's a lot of diversity in these perspectives and a lot of different ways of interpreting one set of data. And yeah, and if we do disagree in these little ways, it's not going to be the end of the world, and it's not going to be the end of a solution.
It might literally be the end of the world.
It's true. And, yeah.
This is the one issue where it's the end of the world.
It's true. That's true. But I think if we're going to tackle it, we can best tackle it with conversation and empathic conversation that recognizes the nuance and
I completely agree. And that's kind of what I'm digging into at the same level, is like, it's very tempting to just say anything that disagrees with me is obviously like a bullshit hoax, and like actually do the science, do the research, do your homework, like figure out what's real and what's not.
Absolutely. And we will definitely revisit the subject because there was a lot that I wanted to talk about unrelated to this book. But it is a vast subject, and I wouldn't mind doing a little bit more research before I revisit it anyway, because this is a very intimidating subject that is very politicized. So I'd like to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much for joining us for another episode of Coyotenomics.
Catch you guys on the next one.